Hey, everybody, welcome to Crackpot, the podcast where each and every week we dive into a different conspiracy theory and we discuss the merits or the demerits of each. We're your hosts. I'm Tim.
And I'm Zach.
And happy holidays.
Happy holidays indeed.
Merry Christmas, even.
Yeah, are you having a Merry Christmas even?
I think so.
Okay.
Yeah. TBD. I'm not quite there yet, but all signs point towards amazing Christmas. What kind of traditions does your family have around Christmas?
You know, it's pretty classic.
Yeah.
I would say typically, well, of course, Christmas morning is a thing.
The big presents under the tree.
Yeah, kids love the presents under the tree, stockings hung with care.
Do you guys make cookies, listen to Christmas songs? Do you go caroling?
Well, the whole thing is, no, don't go caroling.
Okay.
The whole thing kind of spans, 4 or 6 weeks, whatever, because it's like first you get the tree out right around Thanksgiving.
Yep.
Then, of course, you get it set up, and while you're getting it set up, you play the Christmas playlist on Spotify.
That's right. That's right.
Sponsor the show.
Right.
JK, LOL. Then, a week or two later, you're kind of setting out some more stuff, maybe getting some lights up outside. And then by the time Christmas rolls around, it's like, well, Christmas Eve, usually something with my folks, the kids, something like that. Christmas morn, we've got, Santa Claus coming down the old chimney.
Obviously.
So it's pretty classic in that sense.
I like that. I like that.
What you got?
Very similar. Very similar. Mm-hmm. Although one thing we do like in our house is our Christmas music. However, given that my birthday is right next to Christmas season, I have a rule that no Christmas songs before my birthday. You got to wait till December 1st. I am usually looked at as the Scrooge of the household, but you got to draw the line somewhere, folks. Otherwise, we would start listening to Mariah Carey in like July or something.
Yeah, that's true. And that song does not leave your head, usually until July. So yeah, you don't want to pick it up too soon.
But Zach, we were listening to some of these songs a bit ago, and one in particular came across, and like everyone else, I knew the words. I was singing along, and there was a line that kind of stopped me in my tracks. It made absolutely no sense. So We're talking about Andy Williams' 1963 classic, It's the Most Wonderful Time of the Year. Do you know what line I'm talking about?
I will in a second. Tell me, because I know it's going to pop.
He says there'll be scary ghost stories and tales of the glory of Christmases long, long ago. They're talking about how wonderful this time of year is and all the traditions that they follow. And one of them, apparently, is scary ghost stories. And that always makes me like, wait, what?
Yeah, what is this, Halloween?
Right. Thank you.
Yeah.
So I had to do some sleuthing, Zach.
Okay.
I had to try to figure this out because doing nothing, I got nowhere. So, also, I found this out. This song was not written by Andy Williams. It was written by Edward Pola and George Weil, two Eastern European Jews who emigrated to the United States. So that's kind of interesting. And one of them wrote the theme song to Gilligan's Island.
Classy.
Which is kind of cool.
Actually, it does kind of have that same vibe. There's a similar vibe. Okay.
So
cool.
I like that. But scary ghost stories at Christmas, what gives? Now, there is like a very sizable portion of our audience right now that is rolling their eyes, being like, obviously, Tim, scary ghost stories at Christmas. That's what you do. Well, not here in the States, folks. So when I think of scary ghost stories in Christmas, there's really only one story / movie / play that comes to mind, which is...
It's Ebenezer Scrooge. What's the name of the show?
The Muppets Christmas Carol.
Yeah. Why am I forgetting The Night Before? No,
Muppets Christmas Carol.
Christmas Carol. Thank you.
But the only legitimate version besides Dickens, which is, it's fine, is the Muppets Christmas Carol. By far the best Christmas movie of all. But
oh, no, it's not.
Sorry?
Frosty the Snowman.
What? Oh, the animated one?
No. The claymation. That or Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer.
Okay, Rudolph is fine. I'll give you that, but...
Sorry to, put a damper on this, but right. I would take issue with that.
Well, I take issue with anything above the Muppets on my list. But anyway, okay, so this started maybe, at least my research started with Charles Dickens in his 1843 novella, A Christmas Carol. So... Charles Dickens actually played a very big part in popularizing Christmas ghost stories.
I thought you were going to say like the Christmas traditions we all know today.
Well, yes, and although we are not as familiar with them as our friends on the other side of the pond, Zach, he was big into Christmas ghost stories. So the Christmas Carol was, they certainly existed before that, but this was kind of spawned a whole bunch more. And what happened was people liked to gather around in the dead of the winter and tell ghost stories. So ghost stories at Christmas was had peak popularity in Victorian England, and it really began as an oral tradition during the winter solstice. So you think about it, it's like, okay, it gets dark early, it gets super cold, you can't really work outside, you can't really do much, you can't really flip the light switch. So the family gathers around the fireplace. What better thing to do when you're gathered around the fireplace than to tell ghost stories? But the idea of telling scary stories when it's the darkest time of year spans generations and centuries and millennia and cultures and so on and so forth. So that is not something specifically tied to the Victorian era, but it is something that they popularized around that time. Some of the other things that kind of played into this were the Industrial Revolution. So rise of the middle class, and they had more leisure time as well as more spending money to buy magazines, which apparently Charles Dickens was printing and editing like left and right. But when these magazines, these Christmas magazines and so forth would come out, they were filled with authors' ghost stories. Readers would write in with their own ghost stories. They just needed to fill these pages because everyone could not get enough of these.
I had no idea. I love that. And also, it's so logical if you think about it because, yeah, it's super dark like all day.
Right?
They didn't have cell phones, internet, computers, TV. What are you going to do? Sit around and tell stories.
Gotta tell stories.
Although I'm surprised that it is ghost stories, but I guess, yeah, okay. Well, it is dark and scary, so why not?
Yeah, that's kind of it.
Yeah.
One of the things that Charles Dickens did, in addition to kind of popularizing these or making them more popular, was he popularized Christmas themes having to do with forgiveness and reunion, which I thought was interesting. That doesn't necessarily tie in with ghosts one for one, but if you look at A Christmas Carol, you have, at the end, Scrooge sees the wrongness of his ways and he repents and people forgive him, and then he's reunited with his family and they all have a Christmas goose together, right?
Yeah.
But if you think about that, I mean, there's nowhere in like the traditional, Christian Christmas story about forgiveness or reunion necessarily. But if you look at movies like, I don't know, Home Alone, all sorts of forgiveness and reunion.
That's right.
Rudolph, your favorite, one of your favorites.
It is.
Elf even has it. I mean, if you start looking at that theme, it pops up all over the place, which I find fascinating.
Well, actually, now that I think about it, that's a really important point because it does kind of like, there's something about that feeling around Christmas time, and it is kind of like this sense of like, you know what? It's going to end just fine.
Everything's going to turn out all right.
Yeah, and so that actually kind of underscores exactly what you're saying.
Yeah,
so that's
exactly.
actually interesting. Okay.
So the popularity of the Victorian Christmas ghost stories really transcended socioeconomic statuses. Sometimes the characters in the stories were working class people who encountered ghosts. Sometimes the ghost stories took place in haunted manors with butlers and chauffeurs and all sorts of stuff like that. But goes without saying, at least for you and I, that this never really took off in the United States.
That's a little bit surprising, actually, but yeah, okay.
Well, I would say it never took off in the United States because we already had a spooky ghost holiday, which was Halloween. And we celebrate Halloween primarily because of our Irish and Scottish immigrants who came over here and brought the tradition of Samhain, or as we call it, Halloween. So there you go as well.
Okay.
So those poor people in England, they didn't have a Halloween. So they're like, where can we shoehorn these ghosts in? Somewhere. How about Christmas?
Yeah, and we already got our fill by Halloween. So
exactly,
it all works out.
Exactly. And I found this great quote here from Charles Dickens. He said that Christmas Eve is the witching time for storytelling.
That is so counterintuitive.
It is for you, but you're not thinking like a Victorian English person.
Cheerio.
There you go.
Now I got it.
Now that's better. So, folks, I wanted to do something a little bit different this week. Rather than a rerun of, Is Santa Real or something else, I wanted to tell you all a Christmas ghost story. So sit down next to the fireplace, turn up the volume a little bit, grab a glass of hot cocoa or eggnog or something else, and relax. And let's listen to a Christmas ghost story from 1848. And this is called The Ghost Summons by Ada Buisson. It was in the early days of my professional career, when patients were scarce and fees scarcer. And though I was in the act of sitting down to my chop, and had promised myself a glass of steaming punch afterward in honor of the Christmas season, I hurried instantly into my surgery. I entered briskly, but no sooner did I catch sight of the figure standing, leaning against the counter, than I started back with a strange feeling of horror, which for the life of me I could not comprehend. Never shall I forget the ghastliness of that face, the white horror stamped upon every feature, the agony which seemed to sink the very eyes beneath the contracted brows. It was awful to me to behold, unaccustomed as I was to scenes of terror. "You seek advice?" I began, with some hesitation. "No, I am not ill." "Oh, you require then—" "Hush!" he interrupted, approaching more nearly and dropping his already low murmur to a mere whisper. "I believe you are not rich. Would you be willing to earn 1,000 pounds? "Oh, 1,000 pounds! His words seemed to burn my very ears. "Well, I should be thankful if I could do so honestly," I replied with dignity. "What is the service required of me?" A peculiar look of intense horror passed over the white face before me, but the blue-black lips answered firmly, "To attend a deathbed." 1,000 pounds to attend a deathbed? Where am I to go then? Whose is it? "Mine." The voice in which this was said sounded so hollow and distant that involuntarily I shrank back. "Yours? What nonsense! You are not a dying man. You're pale, but you appear perfectly healthy. You—" "Hush!" he interrupted. "I know all this. You cannot be more convinced of my physical health than I myself. Yet I know that before the clock tolls the first hour after midnight, I shall be a dead man." "But—" he shuddered slightly, but stretching out his hand commandingly, motioned me to be silent. "I am but too well informed of what I affirm," he said quietly. "I have received a mysterious summons from the dead. No mortal aid can avail me. I am as doomed as the wretch on whom the judge has passed sentence. I do not come either to seek advice or to argue the matter with you, but simply to buy your services. I offer you 1,000 pounds to pass the night in my chamber and witness the scene that takes place. The sum may appear to you extravagant, but I have no further need to count the cost of any gratification, and the spectacle you will have to witness is no common sight of horror." The words, strange as they were spoken calmly enough, but as the last sentence dropped slowly from the livid lips, an expression of such wild horror again passed over the stranger's face that, in spite of the immense fee, I hesitated to answer. "You fear to trust the promise of a dead man. See here and be convinced," he exclaimed eagerly, and the next instant, on the counter between us lay a parchment document, and following the indication of that white muscular hand, I read the words, "And to Mr. Frederick Keed, of 14 High Street, Alton, I bequeath the sum of 1,000 pounds for certain services rendered to me." I have had that will drawn up within the last 24 hours, and I signed it an hour ago in the presence of a competent witness. I am prepared, you see. Now, do you accept my offer or not? My answer was to walk across the room and take down my hat and then lock the door of the surgery communicating with the house. It was a dark, icy cold night, and somehow the courage and determination which the sight of my own name in connection with £1,000 had given me flagged considerably as I found myself hurried along through the silent darkness by a man whose deathbed I was about to attend. He was grimly silent, but as his hand touched mine, in spite of the frost, it felt like a burning coal. On we went, through the snow, on, till even I grew weary, and at length of my appalled ears struck the chimes of a church clock. Whilst close at hand, I distinguished the snowy hillocks of a churchyard. Heavens! Was this awful scene of which I was to be the witness to take place veritably amongst the dead? 11, groaned the doomed man. Gracious God, but 2 hours more, and that ghostly messenger will bring the summons. Come, come, for mercy's sake, let us hasten. But there was a short road, separating us now from a wall which surrounded a large mansion, and along this we hastened until we reached a small door. Passing through this, in a few minutes, we were stealthily ascending the private staircase to a splendidly furnished apartment, which left no doubt of the wealth of its owner. All was intensely silent. However, through the house, and about this room in particular, there was a stillness that, as I gazed around, struck me as almost ghastly. My companion glanced at the clock on the mantel-shelf and sank into a large chair by the side of the fire with a shudder. "Only an hour and a half longer," he muttered. "Great heaven, I thought I had more fortitude. This horror unmans me." And then, in a fiercer tone and clutching my arm, he added, "Ha! You mock me. You think me mad, but wait till you see. Wait till you see." I put my hand on his wrist, for there was now a fever in his sunken eyes, which checked the superstitious chill which had been gathering over me, and made me hope that, after all, my first suspicion was correct, and that my patient was merely but the victim of some fearful hallucination. "Mock you," I answered soothingly. "Far from it. I sympathize intensely with you, and would do much to aid you. You require sleep. Lie down and leave me to watch." He groaned, but rose and began throwing off his clothes, and watching my opportunity, I slipped a sleeping powder which I had managed to put in my pocket before leaving the surgery into a tumbler of claret that stood beside him. He's actually drugging him to sleep, just so you know.
I was going to say, it sounds like it, yeah.
Victorian England, I don't know.
Respect.
The more I saw, the more I felt convinced that this was the nervous system of my patient which required my attention. And as it was, with sincere satisfaction I saw him drink the wine and then stretch himself on the luxurious bed. "Ha!" thought I, as the clock struck 12, and instead of a groan, the deep breathing of the sleeper sounded through the room. "You won't receive any summons tonight, and I may make myself comfortable." Noiselessly, therefore, I replenished the fire, poured myself out a large glass of wine, and drawing the curtain so that the firelight should not disturb the sleeper, I put myself in a position to follow his example. How long I slept I know not, but suddenly I aroused with a start, and as ghostly a thrill of horror as ever I remembered to have felt in my life. Something, what I knew not, seemed near, something nameless but unutterably awful. I gazed around. The fire emitted a faint blue glow, just sufficient to enable me to see that the room was exactly the same as when I fell asleep, but that the long hand of the clock wanted but 5 minutes of the mysterious hour which was to be the death moment of the summoned man. Was there anything in it, then? Any truth in the strange story he had told? The silence was intense. I could not even hear a breath from the bed, and I was about to rise and approach, when again that awful horror seized me, and at the same moment my eye fell upon the mirror opposite the door, and I saw, great heaven, that awful shape, that ghastly mockery of what had been humanity. Was it really a messenger from the buried, quite dead? It stood there in visible death clothes, but the awful face was ghastly with corruption, and the sunken eyes gleamed forth a green glassy glare which seemed a veritable blast from the infernal fires below. To move or utter a sound in that hideous presence was impossible, and like a statue I sat and saw that strange shape move slowly toward the bed. What was the awful scene enacted there, I know not. I heard nothing, except for a low, stifled, agonized groan, and I saw the shadow of that ghastly messenger bending over the bed. Whether it was some dreadful but wordless sentence its breathless lips conveyed as it stood there, I know not. But for an instant the shadow of a claw-like hand from which the third finger was missing appeared extended over the doomed man's head, and then, as the clock struck one clear silvery stroke, it fell, and a wild shriek rang through the room, a death shriek. I'm not given to fainting, but I certainly confess that the next 10 minutes of my existence was a cold blank. And even when I did manage to stagger to my feet, I gazed around, vainly endeavoring to understand the chilly horror which still possessed me. Thank God the room was rid of that awful presence. I saw that, so, gulping down some wine, I lighted a wax taper and staggered towards the bed, and how I prayed that after all I might have been dreaming, and that my own excited imagination had but conjured up some hideous memory of the dissecting room. But one glance was sufficient to answer that. No, the summons had indeed been given, and answered. I flashed the light over the dead face, swollen, convulsed, still with the death agony, but suddenly I shrank back. Even as I gazed, the expression of the face seemed to change. The blackness faded into a deathly whiteness. The convulsed features relaxed, and even as if the victim of that dread apparition still lived, a sad, solemn smile stole over the pale lips. I was intensely horrified, but still I retained sufficient self-consciousness to be struck professionally by such a phenomenon. Surely there was something more than supernatural agency in all of this. Again, I scrutinized the dead face and even the throat and chest, but with the exception of a tiny pimple on the one temple beneath the cluster of hair, not a mark appeared. To look at the corpse, one would have believed that this man had indeed died by the visitation of God, peacefully, while sleeping. How long I stood there I know not, but time enough to gather my scattered senses and to reflect that, all things considered, my own position would be very unpleasant if I was found thus unexpectedly in the room of a mysteriously dead man. So I, noiselessly as I could, I made my way out of the house. No one met me on the private staircase. The little door opening into the road was easily unfastened, and thankful indeed was I to feel again the wintry fresh air as I hurried along that road by the churchyard. There was a magnificent funeral soon at that church, and it was said that the young widow of the buried man was inconsolable, and then rumors got abroad of a horrible apparition which had been seen on the night of the death, and it was whispered the young widow was terrified and insisted upon leaving her splendid mansion. I was too mystified with the whole affair to risk my reputation by saying what I knew, and I should have allowed my share in it to remain forever buried in oblivion, had I not suddenly heard that the widow, objecting to many of the legacies in the last will of her husband, intended to dispute it on the score of insanity. And then there gradually arose the rumor of his belief in having received a mysterious summons. On this, I went to the lawyer and sent a message to the lady that, as the last person who had attended her husband, I undertook to prove his sanity, and I besought her to grant me an interview in which I would relate as strange and horrible a story as ear had ever heard. The same evening, I received an invitation to go to the mansion. I was ushered immediately into a splendid room, and there, standing before the fire, was the most dazzlingly beautiful young creature I had ever seen. She was very small, but exquisitely made. Had it not been for the dignity of her carriage, I would have believed her a mere child. With a stately bow, she advanced, but she did not speak. "I come on a strange and painful errand," I began, and then I started, for I happened to glance full into her eyes, and from them down to the small right hand grasping the chair. The wedding ring was on that hand. "I conclude you are the Mr. Need who requested permission to tell me some absurd ghost story, and whom my late husband mentions here." And as she spoke, she stretched out her left hand towards something, but what I know not, for my eyes were fixed on that hand. Horror! White and delicate it might be, but it was shaped like a claw, and the third finger was missing. One sentence was enough after that. "Madam, all I can tell you is that the ghost who summoned your husband was marked by a singular deformity. The third finger of the left hand was missing," I said sternly, and the next instant I had left that beautiful, sinful presence. That will was never disputed. The next morning, too, I received a check for £1,000, and the next news I heard of the widow was that she had herself seen that awful apparition and had left the mansion immediately. The end.
Wow, that was something, man.
It was,
creepy.
Yeah. Christmas ghost stories. I am bringing them back. We're starting this tradition again.
I really like how well developed of a story that was.
It was great. The alliteration, the character development, the setting. It had it all, man.
Had it all. Felt like I was there. Happy holidays, folks. Happy New Year's. Merry Christmas, wherever you are at.
Yes. And again, thank you all for listening. Thank you so much. Happy holidays. Merry Christmas. Rate, review, subscribe. Tell your friends. Tell your neighbors. Tell your local widow about our podcast. And we'll see you next week.
Thanks, everybody.